Okay, I think we will get going promptly. Welcome everyone to this session, and I'm delighted to introduce our very own Dr. Will Pomeranz, and I say our very own because of course he's been teaching at Eurasian for a few years. He is currently the Deputy Director of the Kennan Institute for Advanced Studies, but as of next week, he's going to be Acting Director, which is an exciting move, so we will continue to be working with you. As I say, he also teaches law here. Dr. Pomeranz also heads up the Kennan Institute's Rule of Law program, which has conducted major conferences on the Russian Constitution, on separation of powers in Russia and Ukraine. I didn't know there were any, but I guess there are.
We'll be briefly discussing We'll be hitting that theme actually a bit more than I thought.
I look forward to that. And the Jackson-Vanik Amendments, the influence of the European Court of Human Rights and Russian law. He has published widely on issues relating to both constitutional law, economic law. He was a practicing lawyer, so let me tell you about his pedigree. He holds a BA from Haverford College, an MSc from the University of Edinburgh, a JD cum laude from the American University, and a PhD in Russian history from the School of Slavonic and East European Studies in London. So he really likes collecting degrees. And well, you know, there must be some more you can collect. He has practiced international law. He's been a practicing lawyer in the United States and in Moscow. So a very distinguished career, very active in the field. The title of your talk is Putting the Rule Above the Law, Putin's Statist Policies. And for those of you who saw our announcement downstairs, we had a sort of juxtaposed a rather nasty picture of Putin with a picture of Will Pomeranz. Anyway, delighted to see you. Look forward to your talk.
Thanks so much, Angela, and thanks everyone for organizing this talk. Vladimir Putin has now been on the international stage for some 12 years. And we have watched him interact with various world leaders. We have at times looked into his soul. And we have seen him, and sometimes a bit too much of him, quite frankly, in various states of repose and relaxation. And yet, despite this exposure, Putin remains an enigma. His childhood, family, KGB experiences remain shrouded in mystery. In order to crack this mystery, and to better understand his actions since coming back to power, and also over the past 12 years, I think it is necessary to move beyond his biography and to consider his heroes. And as many commentators have pointed out, one person really stands out, and that is Pyotr Stolypin, Russia's prime minister between 1906 and 1911. In 2008, Putin established the Stolypin Medal, which singles out people who have promoted the social economic development of the country. In this sense, I think Putin admires Stolypin the modernizer, the man who tried to reform the economy, create a more independent and self-reliant peasantry, and who worked with new, however flawed, institutions of democracy that emerged after the 1905 revolution. As we all know, however, there are two sides to the Stolypin legacy. Stolypin the modernizer and Stolypin the enforcer, the man who introduced the Stolypin necktie into Russia's vocabulary after the 1905 revolution. There is also Stolypin the reactionary, who changed Russia's electoral laws so that he could have a more conservative and more compliant legislative branch, and the man who relied on the extraordinary powers of Article 87 to pass legislation that otherwise would have been rejected by the Russian Duma at that time. Stolypin justified both policies by his belief in the state, both as a unifying force, but also as an institution that stands outside the law. There are difficult moments, said Stolypin, in the life of the state when the state must necessarily stand higher than the law, and when one must choose between the integrity of theory and the integrity of the state. I think Vladimir Putin viewed the past election cycle in just such terms, that in the aftermath of a failed parliamentary campaign that was only salvaged by massive voter fraud and growing street protests, I think Putin thought that the Russian state was indeed in peril. And Putin used his powers to reinforce the state at the expense of civil rights, the rule of law, and other constitutional principles. So what I'm going to do today is discuss some of the legislative initiatives by Putin that has reinforced the power of the Russian state, But I want to begin with this notion of the state in Russian history, because it is a loaded term that has preoccupied historians, philosophers, commentators for centuries. Now, there's a variety of places to look, but because I am a lawyer, I thought that you need look no further than the actual Russian Constitution. So, the state plays a very important role in defining the nature of the powers within the Russian Federation. To begin with, the state is part of Russia's great historical inheritance from the past. If you read the preamble to the Russian Constitution, it speaks of the need to preserve the historic unity of the state. The state also serves as the basis for unity in Russia today. Article 5, Part 3 states that the federal construction of the Russian Federation is based on state integrity and a united system of state power. Article 77.2 talks about how the national and regional organs of executive power form a unified system of executive power. And it was this specific clause that the Russian Constitutional Court used to uphold President Putin's decision to abolish the direct elections of governors and the notion of a link between all these state institutions. The notion of state power really remains at the heart of this argument and Russia's political institutions. In particular, Article 10, which reads that state power in the Russian Federation shall be exercised on the basis of a division of powers between the legislative, executive, and judicial branches. And the provision adds that these three branches of power are independent. Now, I think many Western commentators actually focus on the latter part of this provision and see in it a notion of separation of powers as the essence of the clause. But for Russians, I think this provision is less clear-cut. The clause begins with the notion of state power, which at all times, from the Russian perspective, constitutional perspective, is single and unified. It then moves to a division of functions within this concept of state power, which requires interaction between the three branches of government, and includes a notion of checks and balances. There is an understanding that there's going to be mutual interaction, mutual exchanges between these branches. However, they're not necessarily seen by commentators as separate and able to operate independently, but really part of a unified whole. So under the Constitution, state power is inextricably linked to the notion of the unified state. Any discussion of state power also leads to the awkward position of the Russian president, who technically is not a part of any branch of government. The government, according to the Constitution, is headed by the Prime Minister, and that is considered the executive branch. Instead, according to Article 82 of the Constitution, the President, in part, is responsible for protecting the state's integrity and ensuring the functioning and interaction of all bodies of state power. The President's oath of office emphasizes this allegiance to the unified state. I vow in performance of my powers as the President of the Russian Federation to respect and protect the rights and freedoms of man and citizen, to observe and protect the Constitution, and to protect the sovereignty and independence, security, and integrity of the state, and to serve the people faithfully. So you can see within the Russian Constitution this persistent emphasis on the notion of the state, that the state precedes the division of powers, and that for the notion of the state, there can only be one state, and that can only be a unified state. As the oath suggests, however, the Russian Constitution does not only support the notion of a unified state, but expounds different competing legal principles as well. For example, there is a strong element of federalism within the Russian Constitution, which is, the Constitution itself describes Russia as a federal state, and includes a division of powers between the center and the regions, with specific jurisdictions designated as solely federal, solely regional, and some areas under joint federal and regional control. The Constitution also enumerates the individual civil and social rights of the Russian people. And this is not necessarily an empty provision as some people think, as Russians have in increasing numbers sought to defend these civil rights and social rights before the Constitutional Court and the European Court of Human Rights. This has led, of course, some commentators to describe Russia as a dual state, combining both democratic and authoritarian features. Getting back to Vladimir Putin, however, it's fair to say that he has not been overly distracted by these various social rights and freedoms and liberties. He also spent the better part of his first 2 terms stripping the regions of their local autonomy in order to create the so-called power vertical. In reality, Putin's priorities primarily concern defending the prerogatives of the state. And in the 5 months since returning to power, he has done exactly that. So what I want to do for the next part of my talk is simply talk about the variety of different legislation that he has introduced and implemented, as well as how it is used with courts as an effort to reinforce the power of the state over the first 5 months of his 3rd term. I'm sure most of you are aware of the new requirements on the non-governmental sector. That the law on the NGOs requires a Russian NGO that receives foreign money and engages in political activity to register as a foreign agent. Now, in addition to draconian reporting requirements that are envisioned in the law, a recipient of foreign money who comes under this definition would have to put the word foreign agent on every publication that it produces. Now, the law itself doesn't come into force until November of this year, so it's still difficult to gauge the exact impact. Some human rights groups have already announced that they will no longer accept foreign money because they don't want to have the label of foreign agent attached to their activities. And the most prominent one of that is the Moscow-Helsinki group. But as I mentioned, the law itself is still very vague. It talks about notions of working in the interests of foreign sources and engaging in political activities without defining terms such as interests or activities. So until these terms get defined and some sort of procedure is in place, then we'll have a better idea as to the scope of the law. Right now, it appears that there's some very good lawyers reading the text very carefully. I'm sure they're finding various loopholes within the law. But the concern is that it's not only going to incorporate groups like the Moscow-Helsinki group and GOLIS and Transparency International, but it could also begin to incorporate business organizations, environmental groups, some aspects of the media as well. So the law itself remains vague. There are lots of people reacting to it, and undoubtedly it sends a chill down the entire NGO sector within Russia. Putin has also enhanced the state by increasing fines for those engaged in civil disobedience through the so-called anti-protest. Now, the fine for participating in an unsanctioned rally has gone up to from 5,000 rubles, or a couple $100s, to $10,000 for individuals and up to $33,000 for organizers. So, not surprising, there's lots of room for interpretation and abuse in this law. My favorite example is the 3 gentlemen who decided to stroll down a street in a small city in Russia, wearing some white ribbons, only to find themselves arrested and charged with engaging in an unsanctioned demonstration. Lyudmila Alexeyeva was about to celebrate her 85th birthday and was very concerned that if all her friends, and she has a lot of friends, came to celebrate, that she would in fact be considered to be engaging in an unsanctioned demonstration. So she sought out the proper authorities to make sure that her birthday party doesn't somehow turns into a more politicized event. I think the authorities clearly fear what might happen if demonstrations get out of hand. Mayor Sobyanin was quoted as saying that if the police did not provide a defense against these demonstrators, then the country essentially would fall into bloody chaos. The debate over this law is not over. It will be appealed to the Constitutional Court, and we'll have to wait and see how it interprets the law. They actually have in the past, at least, had some very progressive rulings on the right to the power of assembly, so it'll be interesting to see how they respond to that. Undoubtedly, the law will also be appealed to the European Court of Human Rights as well. So, again, we still need to wait and see how the law is both enforced and also interpreted by some of the other judicial bodies. A third piece of legislation is this decision by Putin to recriminalize the notion of slander. The whole process of defamation was decriminalized at the end of 2011 as one of President Medvedev's attempts, quote, to humanize the criminal code. And they made it a civil action. which meant that if an individual felt so insulted or demeaned, then he or she could bring a civil action in court. But in such a scenario, of course, the state is on the side. The state is not a party to this actual dispute. By recriminalizing slander, the state again is a player in these types of suits, and one can anticipate that law enforcement agencies in Russia will be reading the papers a little bit more carefully, and potentially finding places and using those types of statements as a means to bring slander, defamation cases in criminal court. The final piece of legislation that I just want to briefly discuss is the new law on governors, because one of the events that transpired after the demonstrations in December, after the parliamentary election, is that Medvedev and Putin decided to reintroduce the concept of direct elections of governors. Russia had direct elections up until 2004, but Putin decided to change the process for national security reasons and essentially has appointed governors ever since. So again, in terms of the development of the state and a unified state, the ability to appoint governors as opposed to subjecting to elections was a very important part of the notion of the unified state, and played an important role in the creation, as I said earlier, of the power vertical. The new law on the direct election of governors initially was thought to provide a change and return to a more direct system of election. But that is not what actually occurred, because what happened was they introduced this notion of the filter. And it's a filter whereby candidates from political parties have to obtain a certain percentage of signatures, between 5 and 10%, from municipal deputies before they can appear on the ballot. The new law also allows the regions to decide whether and how independent candidates can run for governor. Now, not surprisingly, again, this being Russia and Putin's United Russia Party controlling most of the regional legislatures, they have decided to put the filter, in most cases, at rather the high end, requiring 8% or 9% signatures from various municipal deputies. This becomes a real problem because under Putin's system, United Russia controls most of the regional legislatures, and candidates from the other political parties have difficulty registering because they can't get signatures from the other political parties. So for the upcoming first round of gubernatorial elections that are going to take place in October, the Communist Party was only able to register candidates in 3 out of the 5 regions. Just Russia and Yabloko only managed to register a candidate in 1 region. Most regions further gutted the law by not even allowing for the nomination of independent candidates. So I think when you look at the law on governors, what becomes apparent is that important levers were kept in place to allow the Kremlin and the United Russia Party to influence the election of these governors. And that while some regions may have competitive elections, I don't think the horizontal links between the center regions has been broken. I don't think you're about to see the creation of independent governors that you saw in the 1990s with their own power base in the region, but you're going to continue to see people who are elected from the United Russia machinery who owe their allegiance first to the center as opposed to the electorate. Obviously, we'll have to wait and see how events transpire, but in light of how the filter has been introduced and implemented, that appears to be where this law is directed. So those are the major pieces of legislation that I want to discuss. The other thing I wanted to discuss in terms of Putin and strengthening the state is his use of the courts, because he has done something that has, again, traditionally been done in Russia, and that is he has used the courts to instill a healthy dose of fear into ordinary Russian citizens. The most prominent is a case involving a feminist rock punk band that, from a legal standpoint, have real doubts that the activities that occurred in Christ the Savior Church even met the charges of hooliganism, which is defined in the Russian law as a flagrant violation of public order expressed by clear disrespect to society. When you read the indictment, It was surprising to see references to medieval church doctrine. The Constitution at least says Russia is a secular state, but when you read the proceedings against the feminist ban, you seem to have some doubts. And as usual, there was a notable lacking of due process here. The three defendants were denied bail. They instead spent 6 months in preliminary detention. The victims of the crime, this was a very unique interpretation of criminal law, weren't even actually in the church, but watched it on TV. And somehow the offense was so great that they could actually bring a criminal charge even though they weren't physically present at the event. In reviewing testimony, it was discovered that similar testimony down to the same spelling mistakes were ascribed to different witnesses. So you did not see any part of the notions of due process. And I think, as I've argued in the past, really, when you look at these types of cases, it's not how, there's one way to look at kind of the regular cases, the less controversial cases, and they are handled in a regular fashion. But it's the hard cases that really test the legal system. And in the case of Pussy Riot, once again, Russia failed the due process and minimal requirements of a hard case. There are other trials looming. Alexei Navalny appears to be heading to the dock on old charges of embezzlement. We had the example of a Duma deputy being stripped of his position for conducting illegal business activities. And just yesterday, I believe, Alexander Lebedev was indicted on hooligan charges. So it's quite clear that it's open season on Russian businessmen as well, if indeed that's what Putin wants to do. So as usual, the criminal justice system is really doing Putin's bidding whenever he so chooses. And that, of course, has profound implications for Russia's development as a law-based state. So getting back to Putin and Stolypin, I think, like his hero, Putin has put the preservation of the state and all its overarching powers above all other rights. That he does so for certain political reasons, as I think we discussed, but it's also very convenient that the policy fits nicely into Putin's other priorities, namely the pursuit of state capitalism in the one economic sector that he's really concerned about, namely the energy sector. Indeed, by limiting transparency and the power of political opposition, the media and NGOs, Putin can pursue his economic objectives without a lot of public scrutiny, which I think is what he wants. Will this all work? Has the state actually survived this crisis? Again, this is open to discussion, and I'm sure everyone will have an opinion one way or the other. One can say that his public opinion polls, although they vary, there is kind of still a sufficient level of support that will allow him to stay. Despite all his shenanigans, he has a working majority in the Duma, and it's quite clear that they're willing to pass the pieces of legislation that he wants. The gubernatorial elections look like they're going to go his way, and he has other important sources of institutional support, most notably the police, a million person force that is organized on a federal level, and as one of the most corrupt institutions in Russia, really highly supportive of the status quo. At the same time, there are noticeable problems for Putin. There was a very interesting exchange last week between Putin and his government, where Putin kind of criticized the government for not implementing his decrees and not implementing the budget as he had so asked. And Medvedev kind of fired back and essentially stole the money that was supposed to go to Sechin and Rosnefty gas and stuck it in the federal budget. So it's beginning to fray a little bit around the edges. There's a possibility that there could be some genuine intrigue and infighting. In terms of the political trials, it's quite clear that the trial of Pussy Riot did not send the same message as the trial of Mr. Khodorkovsky. You don't see lots of people falling in line behind Mr. Putin. In fact, what the trial, I think, showed was, like other political trials, as a distinct from a show trial, when you allow for a defense and you allow defendants to actually participate in the trial, they can use the trial for their own purposes and their own platform. And so I think there has to be some reconsideration on Putin's part, whether political trials is the way to go, because he will be creating opportunities for the opposition. So it's clear that, Putin, there's an argument that could be made that Putin won't last a year, and there are other arguments that kind of see us in 2024 saying goodbye to Mr. Putin after a very long run. So the interesting thing in comparison to Stolypin is at least Stolypin in 1905, 1906 was responding to a genuine crisis, a genuine revolutionary moment. Unrest in the cities, peasants were engaged in various sort of political activity as well. There was the failed war. So he really faced a crisis in 1905, 1906. Today, the political situation is far less drastic, and the opposition overwhelmingly is asking for evolutionary as opposed to revolutionary change. Unfortunately, even this so far has been too much for Putin, and by relying on the state, he has only polarized the situation rather than diffused it. So I'll close with the notion that Stolypin famously said that he needed 20 years to transform Russia. And as we know, he only had 5. But as I just hinted, when Putin finishes his next term in 2018, he would have had 18 years in power. And there's every possibility that he may seek another 6 years that will get him past the 20-year mark and get him to 24 years in power. There's no question that Putin has transformed Russia. But he has done so far by relying on traditional statist principles that see state unity as the first and most fundamental organizing principle within the Russian constitution. And I think the challenge confronting Russia today, as it has for centuries, is to take this broad and historical notion of the unified state and have it serve as one amongst equal fundamental constitutional principles, as opposed to the first above all other constitutional principles.
Thank you very much. There's a lot of meat in your talk. I'm sure we're going to have a great discussion. I'm going to start off with 2 observations and then ask you a question. The first is that this summer when I was at the St. Petersburg Economic Forum, they had a very high-level panel discussing Stolypin. Everything from the most nationalistic to more liberal people.
He's hot.
And you well, because it's the anniversary, and then there was an American professor I didn't know who'd written a whole book, you may know this, about the influence of American ideas on Stolypin. Anyway, but the bottom line in Russia is always, you think they're discussing Stolypin, which they are, but what they're really discussing is what's happening today. And there were those who said that Stolypin was very bad for Russia because once you start reforming, you unleash all these forces that then lead to, the destruction. We know, of course, how Stolypin ended his life. The second is, and it's on this business about separation of powers or whatever. I remember in the early 90s when Boris Nemtsov was the young, enthusiastic governor of the Nizhny Novgorod region. He came to the United States, I think maybe for his first official trip, and he gave a talk at a think tank, and a number of the people were trying to understand how can you both represent the people of Nizhny Novgorod in Moscow, but also be the president's personal representative there? Isn't that conflict of interest? What about separation of powers? And he could not understand their question. So, maybe it's better to. So, what you've been saying about Putin, the status, the государственник, what you're really saying is that the idea, which is implicit in Western legal philosophy, that the rule of law means that the law is above the state, that really doesn't have any tradition in Russia, right? And this is a serious question. When they talk about rule of law, do they mean more, that you have to observe and implement the laws? But the idea that the state is below the rule of law is surely something that doesn't have any precedence in Russian history.
It doesn't. They've tried various attempts. The whole notion of the государства,
right,
of the rule of law state. In reality, from a Russian perspective, it's much more, it's not linked to our notion of the rule of law state. It's much more related to the German notion of a Rechtsstaat,
right,
and notion of rule by law state. So the hope would be that at some point, at least, a Russian leader would at least agree to be bound by their laws. Exactly, as opposed to kind of thinking that natural law theory and so forth is somehow going to enter Russian legal thought and philosophical thought, and that's going to serve the basis. That's not about to happen. And that's not the basis of either pravo gospodarstvo, or the nature of the civil law system that Russia has. So the issue is, will there ever come a time where Russian leaders feel compelled to be bound by their own laws? And that is the question that we're still searching for, because one can make an argument that maybe Yeltsin was closer to getting there than Putin is, but clearly Putin has not felt so restrained and continues to act in a manner that doesn't restrain him. So he really does feel that, as I mentioned, that in the notion of the state allows him to move beyond any notion of separation of powers and allows him to kind of act above the law.
Thank you. All right, questions, comments? Yeah, Paula.
Thank you. Thank you very much for your talk. I guess my question relates more to what is to be done in this situation. I know you already mentioned the fact that some people are...
We all know Victor
You do mention that in many of these cases, people are studying the law, trying to appeal to European courts, but these are different types of law. For example, in the case of the gubernatorial elections, really, who can solve that? What could be done to change the situation? Is the work done to sort of reverse the effects of this work from the civil society, distinguished by category of different enacted law?
Well, again, what is to be done to begin with requires a leader who is willing to subject themselves to these laws. And what we've seen, I think, over the last 5 months and 6 months is that Putin has gone out of his way to put himself above the law and to try to diminish these rights. I mean, there's an argument to be made that certain legal processes are gaining traction in Russia and have over the last 20 years. For example, there was no constitutional law in the Soviet system. If you thought a law if you were tried in a Soviet court and you thought the law was unconstitutional, you could not stand up in court and say this law is unconstitutional. The only thing you could do is stand up and say, I did not commit this crime, based on the elements of the crime. But there was no constitutional tribunal. There was no place to interpret the Constitution. And that's why a series of Soviet constitutions never really fulfilled their potential, because it's not simply the letter of the law, but it's the ability to interpret this law that gives the Constitution some sort of meaning. So you can argue that over the last 20 years, there has been an evolution. The Constitutional Court has occasionally caved to the central authorities, but all courts tend to do that. The Supreme Court is not unique. The Constitutional Court is not unique to sometimes finding ways to support a political power. Another place where there has been, I think, development in the rule of law is in the arbitrage courts, the commercial courts. Again, the commercial courts essentially were formed at the very end of the Soviet period, but in the post-Soviet period, they have been brand new. And Russia has created a civil law system from scratch, essentially. I mean, it's as usual, it's borrowed various codes from other people in order to create these principles. But if you talk to practitioners of law, the commercial courts have a reasonably strong reputation. They have competent judges. The state doesn't always win in the commercial courts. This is another place where there has been some profound change, and Putin and Medvedev have all allowed that change to occur. Where if you look kind of at the inadequacies of the Russian legal system, they're primarily in the courts of general jurisdiction and in the criminal justice system. So what is to be done? If I could do one thing immediately, I'd fire 1 million policemen and try to find new policemen, try to create civil police. But that did work in 1917, and I don't think it would work today. So, I mean, the police, I mean, even the head of the Ministry of Internal Affairs says that, a huge number of police are engaged in racketeering activities. If you read the details of the Magnitsky case, and that's not an isolated case, you look at the police, you look at the investigators, the judge is kind of the last stage of it. The judge isn't even that important. It's the prison officials, the investigators, the police, and the tax authorities. They're the ones who are able to do this, and unencumbered by anything. And what is the state's response? To begin with, they go after Magnitsky as the whistleblower, as opposed to the people who stole $230 million from the state. And then once poor Magnitsky dies in jail, they reward the investigators for conducting such an outstanding investigation. So the criminal justice system in Russia, and I wouldn't even start with the judiciary, I would start with the police. And I've talked to experts in police reform, but it's just so difficult to imagine where to start. I mean, in Georgia, they fired low-level policemen, and that made a big difference. Whether they could do that in Russia, I just don't know. They were supposed to begin firing policemen when they had police reform 2 years ago, and they didn't fire them.
Will's comments about the legal profession in Russia is a great segue into the question I want to ask. And I just came back from a week in Moscow for the U.S. government on precisely this point. The question Angela posed is I think, a great question. How does Gorbachev as a personality, he chose to do things differently in terms of applying laws to himself, to the state. There's a question about what Putin is doing. The question that the U.S. government is now wrestling with is how does one influence the decision of a Putin or somebody like him in the future in that direction? One can push, one can entice, one can do a mixture of the two. And that's, to my mind, the very much, what is to be done kind of question, which really hits the
But the question there is Putin even listening? I mean, Gazprom was just about to be dragged into a European court proceeding. What was the first thing that Putin did? He passed an amendment to the strategic sector's company law and said you can't go talk to anybody. Don't give anything to him. You can't because that's what the law says. What did Gazprom say when the charges were brought? We're a public entity. How could you do this to a public entity like this, where we serve the public good in Russia? It was a complete misinterpretation. So, I mean, one had always hoped that kind of integrating Russia into international organizations would somehow change the mentality. What was Putin's first comment when he joined the WTO? Oh, we need to change it. We need to change it. We need to allow other emerging markets to protect their national industries in times of crisis. He didn't even go to a meeting yet. He's already announcing it. He wants to change everything. He at least could have shown up for a gathering before he announced his intentions. But he wasn't willing to do so. So I mean, it's easy to say what is to be done. I mean, I think after 20 years, after 20 years, you'd have to say that it needs to now come from within, and there are very outstanding lawyers from within who can implement, who can lead these changes. The story I always tell is when I worked at the law firm in Moscow. When I started, half the lawyers were expats and half the lawyers were Russian. When I left, I was the last expat hired, and they were never going to hire another expat lawyer because they had too many good Russian lawyers right there at their fingertips. So there are resources that exist in Russia that can lead this change. And you talk about how do you influence Putin. I think we're finding it's very difficult to get in touch with Mr. Putin and really influence his policy.
I've got a question about actually the lawyers who are now in Russia. There was, and I think they might have had to stop their activities, a USAID organization called the Russian American Rule of Law Consortium. And the idea was to bring American lawyers and judges over to Russia, especially to the regions, and to bring judges and lawyers from Russia over to the US. It particularly worked on the level of the judiciary. And the idea was that through this engagement and through discussions about the rule of law in both countries, there would be an equal exchange. Of course, the US side always viewed themselves as teaching the Russians about the rule of law. Is there any sign that that sort of more civil society-based engagement, rather than coming from the top, but that sort of professional engagement has any effect?
I think professional engagement is always, I think on a certain level it's a very good idea. Those type of exchanges, peer-to-peer exchanges, are very productive. I think Russians gain a lot when they see how US judges control the courtroom and handle the courtroom. I think Russian judges can learn about how judges organize their own activities. In Russia, it's very hierarchical, with the court chair having a lot of control over different judges. In the United States, the head of a court is the first amongst equals. And so it's a different way of administering justice, a different way of interacting. All those things are good things to learn. There are areas of law that sometimes Russians need greater guidance on, and they can gain that guidance by interacting with US judges. My hesitation nowadays is, or my hesitation in all this is that you have to remember that they're two very distinct legal systems that they're talking about. You're talking about a civil law system and a common law system. And at a certain level, there's going to be a huge disconnect between what judges do and how they write their opinions and how they handle cases in a civil law court system than in an American system. So that when you read a judicial opinion, a Russian judicial opinion, it cites the law. You know, there's no 20 cases cited and precedents and slicing through them in order to come to the determination of the law. For a Russian judge, and for a Russian judge to maintain their independence, they need to not be concerned necessarily with 20 precedent cases, but be able to look at the law and make a determination based on the law in front of them. So it's a very different approach to judicial reasoning that doesn't include a long meandering through a lot of precedents. Now, there have been examples where courts have asserted precedent, and it's not as if judicial opinions don't matter in Russia, because they do. There are informal ways of enforcing judicial opinions through notions of judicial practice. So it's not as if decisions are unimportant, but you have to understand how a Russian judge looks at the law. They look for the norms, they look for detail in the law, and that's how they make the determination. And the notion of precedent, which is so crucial for American judges, doesn't come into play to the extent that it does in the United States.
Well, I want to get back to the issue of government elections and the filters, because there's a lot of debate out there right now about, is there even with this current system ways of getting around it? So I was hoping that you might get down to a few more cases or give us a sense of where we are at this point with the dynamics of the governors and the filters.
Well, I understand that there were 3 cases that are fairly straightforward right now in terms of the upcoming October elections, but in 2 regions there was controversy in terms of the standing of the United Russian candidate. One was in Eurasian, and the other was, I forget what the other one is. But in both cases, there's already been government shenanigans. For example, in one of the regions, they didn't register the Just Russia candidate, who was the prime opponent. So he's not on the ballot, so that gives a more direct route to the United Russia candidate. In the other region, where they thought it was going to be contested, the main opposition resigned, and the United Russia person basically said, I plan to appoint him as senator. We'll make sure that he becomes the senator in the Federation
So there have
Council.
already been quid pro quos.
There have already been quid pro quos to try to make sure that United Russia comes out on top in all 5 of these elections. Now, we still, I mean, they will actually vote, and you know, there is a tradition, at least in the 1990s, of governors losing elections. So we will have to wait and see whether they face the same prospect this time around. But clearly they've manipulated the system to give United Russia the best shot at winning these elections.
So, you know, Russia is a society in which, in general, you know, not uniformly, but in general, trust in the legal system, legal institutions is quite low. People recognize that the law is manipulated for political purposes, for business purposes, all sorts of group interests. But at the same time, if you look at the only public opinion polls we have regarding many of these recent measures, and you can question how reliable they are, but in any case, that's what all of them seem to be saying, majorities seem to be in favor of many of these measures. There was a Levada Center poll, for instance, that showed that, you know, the large majority of Russians favored depriving Gennady Gudkov of his seat in Duma. So how do you explain that paradox that there's low trust in legal institutions, yet at the same time, people who may recognize at an abstract level that legal institutions are manipulated support, at least or say they support in public opinion polls, these same types of manipulations?
Are you talking about the courts, or are you talking about the political ramifications of these actions, because, I mean, there is this low trust in the courts, and yet what scholars like Kathy Henley have shown is people increasingly are going to the courts anyway. So they may say they don't trust the courts, but where else are they going to go? Well, actually, they do have one. They could go to the prosecutor's office, and they could handle the case for them, or they can go to court. But there has been a dramatic shift in the increase in the number of people pursuing civil litigation, which suggests that even though they say they have low trust in the judicial institutions, they really don't have any place else to go to resolve these issues. You can find the same thing in the Tsarist period as well. You know, from 1864 to 1914, a dramatic increase in the number of civil cases in the regular courts, in the commercial courts, and in the justice of the peace courts. So you have this emerging trust to the courts, even though you can go to any period of Russian history and drag out the quote that says that no one trusts the courts. Yet people end up going to the courts. And it's hard to judge necessarily where they come out from the experience with greater trust of the courts or not. Polls would suggest if, you know, the discontent suggests that they might not. But, so I think in terms of the low trust in the courts, it's not only the opinion poll, but you should look at how people are using the courts in greater numbers to suggest that there maybe is greater confidence in some aspects of the courts than those polls suggest. As for the people's reaction to the laws, yes, I think, you know, Putin is not without support. And, you know, the polls that suggest he's in the 40s, the polls that suggest he's in the 60s. And I think there were plenty of people who supported the actions against Pussy Riot. There were people who support all these actions. I think that highlights the difficult path in front of the opposition. You know, can urban Moscow-based opposition really unite the country and do something about this? Or does Putin have this kind of residue of support out there that allows him to keep going? It's very difficult to say, but it's true that, you know, a portion of the population, and sometimes a significant proportion, supports this legislation. I don't think there was great support for the anti-protest law. I think that was one that people were not very happy with.
Yeah.
I have a question about the means that Putin's using to strengthen the state. Have you heard about the Blacklist law? The law that is going to allow the government to blacklist certain websites and also to request that certain content is removed from websites too.
Yes, I am familiar with the law. It's the censorship law.
Yeah.
And it was written, I mean, again, the devil's going to be in how it's implemented. I mean, on the face of it, it's a very straightforward law. It deals with child pornography. It deals with questions of terrorism and extremism and so forth, about, you know, the ability to take that material off a website. The question becomes, you know, how is that implemented and how do they go after servers who are hosting these types of websites and so forth. So I am familiar with the censorship law. There are lots of people who are very concerned as to how it's going to, what are its ramifications and how it's going to be implemented. On the face of it, I mean, that law was more reasonable on the face of it than the other piece of legislation, but it, of course, is open to abuse. And one should assume that it wasn't passed just to address those issues.
Okay, so we're talking about how it has to be the leader who allows himself to be basically governed by the laws. Do you think it would be a greater chance of internal pressure having that come about, or external pressure, since we've seen a lot of international focus on the Russian law system and all the cases that have been coming through lately, namely, especially with Putin basically protecting Gazprom and Pussy Riot?
I think it has to come from internal pressure. I think this after 20 years now, if this doesn't happen internally, it just won't happen. There was a debate in the European Parliament that I watched in reaction to the Pussy Riot case, and they, you know, condemned the actions and so forth. And their immediate reaction was, "And now we must begin the dialogue." And that's what there's nothing wrong with it. That's what they do. And the dialogue by the European Court has been tremendously influential. You shouldn't underestimate that. When you read constitutional court decisions, they are littered with references to the European Court of Human Rights. And those decisions have played an important role in terms of their integration into Russian law. So those types of influences are very important, but at this stage, it's going to have to come from inside the country.
Yeah, some factual information on your question about the Russian-American Rule of Law Consortium. I was a reviewer for USAID on that program about 7 or 8 years ago. It was a very good program, and it was very well respected by the Russians generally. One of the partnerships involved the state of Maryland, where I was connected, and the chair on the American side was Judge Alan Wilner of the Maryland Court of Appeals, the highest court in Maryland. The chair on the Russian side was a gentleman named Sergei Narishkin, who in those days was the head of the court reform process and many other things in Leningrad, St. Petersburg Oblast, which was the Maryland partner. Narishkin did a great job. I met him a couple of times, and he and his colleagues did a great job in terms of modernizing, as precisely as Will said, the operation of the court system, and he considered that a very positive experience, is my understanding. Unfortunately, the funding situation, and it had no, to my knowledge, any opposition on the part of the Russians. It was more a sense of, money's dried up. The program did not expand into the business community, which would have been its logical growth sector, and it still exists in a small way as kind of an appendage to the Library of Congress Eurasian Russia Visitors Program, which is still going strong, albeit somewhat budgetarily reduced. And in fact, there was a delegation of Russian judges here last week with one of the judges I'm working with, so I'm curious to find out how it went. I slightly disagree with Will in terms of the dissonance or the disconnect between the Russian and the U.S. judging system. There is something of a difference between the Russian constitutional system or the mindset on constitutional law questions. But I would say that affects, maybe 10% of what the Russian judges get. But that's it.
I wasn't talking about constitutional law, I was talking about civil.
Well,
It's different because the Constitutional Court does cite cases and does behave in much more, in a manner much more similar to a U.S. court. It's a distinction of the Constitutional Court, but the Constitutional Court, from my perspective at least, is an add-on, post-World War II add-on to the civil law system.
No,
so it's not of the civil law system.
I would agree with you. What I'm driving at is that that's only about a 10% difference between how the Russian judges, or what the Russian judges get out of their experience, and how easily our judges communicate with them, and vice versa. The language barrier may be more of an issue.
Thank you. Is there another? Yes.
I was just going to say, I have printed in front of me the Pew Research 39-page report of the survey that they took last May. And at that point, Putin had a 72% approval rating, and they did 1,000 interviews with people on the street. That's pretty darn good, but at the same time, getting to what you were saying, 58% of the folks thought, they thought the protests were sincere and were not generated by foreign interests and so forth. So, while they like Putin, they don't necessarily like a lot of things he's doing. And, that's not unique to Russia. I
read a poll today that we get high percentage of like, but no one trusted him. Low percent of trust.
Yeah.
So, I leave it to the pollsters to try to figure that out.
Yeah, well, I just remember back in the 80s, it was what Putin's approval rating is really high among women. I guess they like the shirtless photographs. I don't know. But I remember in the 80s, and well, you were too young to remember this, but remember all those surveys that came out saying, well, people think Reagan spends too much on defense, they think he's too insensitive to women, he's too prone to help rich people, but who are you going to vote for? I'm voting for Reagan. So that's actually a pretty common thing.
The women probably like him because he's so good with animals.
Exactly. When he goes diving for treasure, he always comes up with the birds.
Yeah. But the point
He saves tigers,
Exactly.
birds,
He's flying with the birds, exactly.
That's hilarious.
What's not to love?
His French guy on that is in Siberia, that picture of the cranes.
Well, the point that they make there is that people, they associate him with order, and Russians don't like chaos. Few people do, and that's one of the big appeals he has, is that he represents order, whereas they look back at what they had with Yeltsin, and that was chaos, and that was bad.
That's exactly right. That's exactly right, and that attitude continues to persist today.
Any other questions? Well, thank you very much. This was great. And I guess we won't look anytime soon for a major change, but I guess we'll continue engaging in this.